Hi, this is Jean Curington, and this is my presentation for my collaboration. I wrote this as sort of a play on a love story, and I called it a collaboration story. Flip Snack had a love story kind of photo album set up, and I kind of took it off of there. I could do two things. I could send this to the staff and just let them read it as they wanted if we weren't going to have a staff meeting, because sometimes our staff has those moments, and I'm sure the people who would be interested would probably read it. But if I was given time at a staff meeting, I would also make this presentation where I would read the book and kind of have discussions as I went with what Mrs. Hankins and I had done. So that's what I'm going to do here. So this is a collaboration story, A Librarian and Teacher by Jean Curington. So getting started, it all started when Mrs. Hankins decided she needed help motivating her students to write. She approached the librarian and asked for help. Mrs. Curington was excited to work in collaboration with Mrs. Hankins. They got started immediately. So our co-planning. Together they sat down and started planning. It became obvious to Mrs. Curington that Mrs. Hankins needed help motivating her students to write and complete sentences. They also needed help using new vocabulary in their writing. Immediately, Mrs. Curington knew what to do. She introduced Mrs. Hankins to Storybird. Together they knew this would be the trick to motivate these students to write. Together they decided to create a lesson using the vocabulary the students were learning each week from the storyteller. So each week we have the storyteller come for 4th grade, and the kids get new vocabulary. We want them to use that vocabulary in their writing. Mrs. Hankins was not having that happen. So we've got some pictures of us pre-planning as well as a screenshot of Storybird. Co-teaching. Mrs. Hankins worked with her students to make sure they were comfortable with the storyteller vocabulary. Then she brought her class to meet with Mrs. Curington. The children were introduced to the Storybird website and shown final products. They were then given usernames and were able to set up their accounts. Together, they all set up their vocabulary journals and began making their books. The librarian and teacher facilitated, while the students were actively engaged with their partners. So here, Mrs. Hankins had worked with her kids before coming to me to make sure that they were completely comfortable with the vocabulary, so that we were starting with something they were already feeling success with. And then she also had already set up, I showed her how to set up the account usernames, and so we had to give the kids their usernames and passwords, and then everybody changed their password together. So there are pictures of me doing the initial introduction to Storybird, and then Mrs. Hankins and I both working through the class as we went. I have a double portable, so we were able to have the kids spread out and really work on this together. Co-assessing. Once the lesson was complete, the teacher and librarian sat down to discuss the outcomes. Mrs. Curington showed Mrs. Hankins how to comment on her students' journals. Together they made some comments and waited to see how the students would react. Over the next couple of days, Storybird was all the students could talk about. They wanted to write as soon as they walked in the door. Mrs. Hankins reported that the students were finally motivated to write. In the weeks that followed, she also reported growth in their ability to write grammatically correct sentences. She also saw growth in their editing skills. So these were two huge jumps for her. These were ELL students, and this is an area that our school needs to work on for STAR. And so having these two areas show growth almost immediately was a huge step. This is a screenshot of what you would see as the teacher. So this was one of our students' book page for the words, and then you can click on their other pages here, and then you can write your comments. So here we've added one of the student pages. This one was the page Ms. Hankins wanted to include because for the word ooze, which is a favorite word among our kids, she wrote, Alexander had a booger oozing out of his nose and touched it. Well, her favorite part about this was she took the the suffix ing and added it to ooze and dropped the e. So this is a skill that Mrs. Hankins wasn't seeing before. It was one of our spelling words. We do scientific spelling where we had the dropping rule, all these things, and it had not been happening. But using this child showed that rule in their sentence. And so that was a great moment for Mrs. Hankins. So in our reflections, Mrs. Hankins and Mrs. Carrington agreed that this activity was well worth the effort. It was a great advantage to collaborate on this project. Mrs. Carrington had undertaken this exercise on her own before, and she felt that working together was a huge benefit. Since Mrs. Carrington already had completed projects to show the children, they were able to envision their own product. They also enjoyed the change of classroom and working together with devices. This would not have been possible alone since each teacher only has 7. I have more because of what I'm doing right now as a librarian in training. The value to the students was immeasurable. They were excited to write and create in this new format. Working in collaboration, the 2 educators were able to meet the needs of their students. The main obstacle they faced was finding time to work together. This was easily overcome, and the advantages were great. Mrs. Hankins has a class of excited writers, and Mrs. Carrington is enjoying the newfound relationships with these students. So this had advantages for both Mrs. Hankins and Mrs. Carrington. And the disadvantage of trying to find a time was easily worked out because we wanted it. And so we worked to find a time to make it happen. And so in closing, I hope that as your librarian, you will want to come and be a part of a collaboration with me. Thank you very much.